Jacobs speaker series for this academic year.
Wow.
And I am especially delighted to welcome Déana Scipio. Did I do that right? Okay. To open up our series for this year. Déana is got her PhD at University of Washington in Learning Sciences, working with Phil Bell. A couple of years, they'll won't even talk about who your department chair is or who your advisor was anymore. She's interested in broadening participation in STEM for youth and adults from non-dominant groups and what it means to participate in STEM. She's done a lot of work on mentorship, and I'm not going to spend lots of time doing the work because I'd love to let the work speak for itself. She'll have about an hour to talk, and then we can have another half hour for questions, and then there'll be pizza out on the balcony. So I'm looking forward to hearing your talk. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for having me here today. So my talk is entitled Designing for Broadening Participation and Deep Hanging in an Out-of-School Time STEM Program. And so I'm currently a postdoc fellow at the Sheshe Kone Center at Turk. And I'm quite delighted to have them as part of my mentoring team, and I've been learning a lot while there. Thumbs up for postdocs. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Project Cool. We're going to talk about broadening participation writ large, how I think about it, and how I'm hoping that more people will come to think about it as well. I'm going to tell you about Eva, one of the mentors in our program, and sort of share her case study. One section of it being around her becoming a scientist, and the other section of it around the design work that she did as a mentor in Project Cool. We're going to talk about deep hanging, provocative term, but hang with me for a while, we'll get there. And then we'll talk about the design implications of the work as well. So my research interests, writ large, are around broadening participation. And when I say broadening participation, I don't just mean adding more people from non-dominant communities to existing STEM paradigms. I also mean broadening what it means to participate in STEM. And I've done that and studied this in lots of different contexts. So one, by designing STEM out-of-school time programming for youth from non-dominant communities. Also, thinking about the cultural learning pathways of scientists from non-dominant communities. So studying the stories of people who have gone through this themselves to better understand what it took for them to stick with it or why they made the choice to go in another direction. Also, I've been working with undergraduate scientists learning in practice during their participation in an out-of-school time STEM program, Project Cool. So I want to tell you a little bit about the conceptual territory that informs my work. So we have lots of really rich accounts of youth learning in informal or out-of-school time. Those talk largely about identity shifts, changes in participation, ways that young people have come to see themselves and identify with STEM domains over time. And that rich body of literature has led us to conclude that out-of-school time environments can play a really important role in the broadening participation stories, especially those of folks from non-dominant communities. And my contention, and that of my research collaborators as well, is that design-based environments, out-of-school time environments specifically, can really serve as layered learning environments where folks from all different parts of the socio-material infrastructure are learning. Adults, youth, scientists, all of the partners within a learning environment are teaching and learning at the same time. So again, to return to this idea of broadening participation, a lot of times when people speak about it, what they mean is they are interested in adding more people from non-dominant backgrounds to STEM degrees, careers, fields, and pathways into or out of those. There's a lot of different justifications that people come up with for why this is an important activity. They talk about empowering community participation, they talk about expanding what counts. Example, the kind of questions that people ask, the participants that are part of the study, the data, the methods, the analysis. Some people, more aligned with the way that I think about it, talk about making important contributions to the field. So not just broadening participation for the sake of the folks from non-dominant communities, but thinking about how their ways of knowing, ways of thinking, analysis methods, strategies actually bring really important new perspectives into STEM fields. And this is all in the interest of addressing underrepresentation. The underrepresentation frame includes not only individual participants, but also institutions. So rural institutions, women-serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities are all, by the definitions NSF and NIH put forth, underrepresented within grants as well as individual scientists participating in those communities. So we end up with a really interesting and, for me, a very tense conversation with a particular metaphor, the Leaky Pipeline metaphor. And I imagine that you might be familiar with this particular diagram. So at the beginning, you've got 9th graders, lots of them starting off like, oh, science is interesting, I want to be a scientist, this is cool. And then over time, the pipe gets narrower and narrower, and then at the very end, we have a little cup that catches the folks that have graduated with STEM degrees. And I imagine that the people that are in this cup are research scientists, they are academics, they are perhaps working in industry. But these are fields that are all directly related to, and someone could draw a through line from taking science classes in middle school all the way to graduating with a STEM degree, going into STEM career. The tension that I feel is that at the same time that it's important to really increase non-dominant community participation for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, a lot of the arguments are around workforce, where they're interested in the changing demographics within the United States that are directly connected to changing demographics around STEM participation, and that's why it's really important to have more folks from non-dominant communities participating. The conversation doesn't often go in the direction of engaged citizenry. And what does it mean for non-dominant communities to have people within those communities asking and pushing for change based upon the needs of the community and in responsive ways to what's happening within communities. And as I said, a lot of those conversations are not around better science and what it might mean to do better science for the entire community. So I've been troubling the pipeline, kind of poking at it, trying to figure out what else could it mean, what other kinds of metaphors could we use, because it bothers me for some pretty fundamental reasons. I think that the pipeline, while it attempted to address underrepresentation, also promotes an ever-narrowing definition of what participation means. So if participation in high school or elementary school or middle school meant that you liked science and you thought it was interesting, by the time you get to your degree, you graduate with your degree, then STEM participation means going into industry or getting a further STEM career degree, or it has a very narrow definition. We really depict participants either as passive drops moving through the pipeline or as the drips that fell out and went down the drain. That's a pretty terrible metaphor to think about. And technically speaking, I'm a drip. I started off as a biology major thinking that I would be a veterinarian, and I hit organic chemistry. And so I fell out of the pipeline. And that's another reason why this work is really interesting to me, to think about what beyond content, what beyond capability could be influencing whether or not people choose to identify as STEM participants or continue to do so. I think it really privileges an assimilationist narrative, which means that if you participate in STEM in this particular way, you can stay in the pipeline. If not, you become a STEM researcher or a STEM policy person or a STEM teacher, you can't stay in the STEM pipeline. You can be adjacent, but you're not part of the pipeline. And I don't think it addresses codes of power or really thinks about what scientific literacy might mean and the implications of that for communities of color. And really, as educators, it turns us into plumbers. We're trying to fix the pipeline and use some plumber's tape here where the drips are and tie a piece of cloth in this other spot to see if we can absorb some of them. And our goal is to make the pipe as effective as possible, to keep as many people in and move as many through. And I think of Jean Lave's charge to the learning sciences community at ICLS in 2014. She said, if you only focus upon the problem, that problem defines what you see when you look. However, if we think about what's actually happening in communities and what's happening in classrooms and what's happening in spaces where people are learning STEM, we have a much broader picture of what it looks like to participate. So here's my research context over time. With all of that in mind, thinking about broadening definitions of what it means to participate and why the pipeline is troublesome, we, connection with my collaborators, designed 6-year DBR project. And this design-based research project was a partnership between a learning sciences lab, a chemical oceanography lab, and local out-of-school time youth serving organizations. And we were really focused on broadening participation in the geosciences, because we were funded through an NSF grant, and the opportunities for enhancing diversity in the geosciences directive. And the design principles were largely influenced by a lot of the conversation around what does it mean to broaden participation and how do you design for that. And so we were invested in positioning youth as developing experts. We wanted to build bridges between youth's everyday STEM expertise and then the discipline-specific STEM practices that they engage in. We wanted to really engage them in contemporary science. And earlier today I talked with the apprenticeship group about why that's so important. We felt that contemporary science was a space where scientists themselves were much more open to the concepts of not translating knowledge, but developing knowledge. And we wanted to position young people also as knowledge generators, not just people who were taking in knowledge. And we did all these things to really create a space for youth mentor collaboration around scientifically rigorous, personally and community relevant projects. And this diacritical mark sometimes gets me in trouble, but what I mean is to erase some of the hierarchies between the youth and the scientists and the youth and the mentors. And I feel like that orientation was a major part of the reason that we did the work that we did and our approaches to doing contemporary sciences with youth and adult participants. So here's some more pictures of our program. We have our mentors who were both graduate and undergraduate students, middle school students. This is probably one of my favorite pictures. This is the first time that one of our young people, she's holding a sea cucumber. And I don't know if you can tell by her body language, but it's probably one of the grossest things that she's ever held, at least according to her in follow-up interviews. And then we have research scientists. And at all different levels of this program, people were teaching and learning. So Project Cool, when I say a layered learning environment, that's really what I mean. All these folks teaching and learning different things, different components of the program. We have a 2-quarter undergraduate class in the winter that was really about experiencing the cool curriculum as learners, and then using reflective practices to help think about what they were learning and how they were learning it, and also helping them deeply understand the science that was behind the set of activities that we were engaging in together. And then in the spring, while they were simultaneously in the out-of-school time settings teaching, they were also coming back to our program for debrief, planning, and reflection. The middle school out-of-school time program happened at multiple sites. We were engaging in the youth in contemporary science, ocean sciences. They were developing personally relevant projects that they then presented either at posters, one at an international conference, and then at a local conference, the students did presentations using PowerPoints, something like this one. We had collaborative design projects over time with the ocean scientists who were developing curriculum with us. So whenever we wanted to come up with a new activity, we went directly to the ocean scientists or the mentors who provided the other part of the infrastructure to help us think deeply about how is this contemporary science and how are the young folks doing things that are directly connected to that. And we were also with them building science communication artifacts. And the research questions guiding today's talk are twofold. We're gonna, for the first part of the talk, focus on question 1. What can we learn about the STEM trajectories of participants from non-dominant communities from their narratives of being and becoming scientists? So when I use the terms being and becoming here, I'm doing it in a very deliberate way. Think of being as sort of your state of being in the way that Heron Cole and Myrtle define it, as your sense of who you are in the world, the way that you move in the world, the way that you are positioned in the world. And I think of becoming as this longer trajectory of a narrative that explains how you move from one place to another. And that when we think of scientists, they have to have a sense of being, like this is something I can be, but they also have to have a pathway of becoming. These are the steps I'm going to take to get there. Over time, our mentor cohort included a lot of different participants. As you can see, lots of different majors within the sciences. The child development was actually in the College of Education. We had a largely female cohort of mentors over time. We had a variety of ethnic backgrounds and actually pretty wide age range as well. It's interesting to note that 10 of the scientists participating in our program over time were people of color. We had 6 graduate students and 11 undergraduates. I think it's quite interesting when there is an underrepresentation narrative of people of color in STEM, what would bring them to a project like Cool? Why would they choose to spend their time in Cool? And I'm hoping that over the course of the talk, the answer, or some of the answer to that question will become more clear. So also with the apprenticeship group this morning, talked about the wonders of a design-based research project and the plethora of data that is available. 6 years of ethnographic field notes, over 3 out-of-school time sites, over 400 hours of video and audio tapes, over 40 hours of semi-structured interviews with participants, youth participants, scientists, the mentor participants, as well as lots of different artifacts. And I guess I would also like to mention that for my dissertation, I focused on a subset of those things. And for this talk, I'm going to focus on an even smaller subset. But to give you a picture of the way that I approached analysis of each of these different kinds of data, I have this slide. So semi-structured interviews, transcription and open coding, looking for themes across the data. Ethnographic field notes really were used to identify moments of practice, specifically mentoring practices that were characteristic of the way that each of the different mentors in the program worked with young people. Curriculum design documents were used to track the design decisions over time and the ways that the mentors and scientists participated in changing and designing curriculum for broadening participation. And then the out-of-school time video was used mostly to look at those moments of mentoring practice that I had identified from the field notes and compare them, constant comparative stuff. So for today's talk, I'm really going to focus on the semi-structured interviews and curriculum design documents. And I want to introduce you to Eva. Eva was one of the graduate mentors in our program. She self-identifies as Polish and Latina. She was a first-generation college student. So she's the first person in her not only immediate but also extended family to go to college. She got an undergraduate biology degree, and she was a lab technician at a cancer research center. Then, through a process which I'll describe to you in greater detail in a moment, she chose to go and get a master's in sciences, in fishery and aquatic sciences. And she currently does policy work at a local university. In order to deeply understand Eva's trajectory and Eva's journey, I leveraged the Cultural Learning Pathways framework, which was developed by Phil Bell, Carrie Zoe, Leah Bricker, and Anne-Marie Darrow Baines. So this framework allows us to think about the ways that constellations of situated events over time can laminate or add up to socio-material practices and orientations towards things like interests and concerns, coordinated participation, social relationships, and identities. What's really interesting to note about these constellations of situated events is similar to chat. They are called out analytically, but not because it's actually possible to separate these things one from another. But when you look at a situated event, you want to consider the places. What are the expectations, the socio-material arrangements in that location? But that could be a physical location or a mental location. The actions, the discourses, the stances, what's at play? Is there a larger discourse around Western science? Yes, most often. Positions, storylines, who are the kinds of people that are typically in this space, and who are the kinds of people that are granted entry? What does that look like? And what are the storylines for people who choose to stay in or choose to get out? So we're tracing people developing in these structures of social practice, as Dreyer would say. We're thinking about how these experiences laminate over time to lead to this intertwined learning outcomes. And this framework had traditionally been used to think about the experiences of youth participants. And I wanted to think about the experiences of folks within our layered learning environment. So while I was interested in the youth participants, I was also really interested in the folks that are supposed to be creating these transformative spaces for young people. And that's where my interest in the mentors really grew from. So I'm going to walk you through an example of a cultural learning pathway, and then we'll talk in greater detail about the constellations of situated events that led up to developing this pathway. So we place these actions positions, but as I said, it's really difficult to disentangle which one is which. But Eva, in her role as a lab technician at the Cancer Research Center, was then invited to participate in lab meetings. So at one time, you could imagine going to the physical location of the lab meeting, that's a place. She's been positioned in a different way, however. She had a legitimate role within the lab as a lab technician, but she's now being positioned to do something slightly different. It's also an action. She's choosing to take this action to go to the lab meetings and to get this new orientation around the work that she might do. Thanks to that, she begins to see her peers as partners and to understand the value of graduate school, because she's spending time with postdocs, with graduate students themselves, with the PIs in a deeper relationship where they talk about why they're doing the things that they're doing instead of just assigning her a set of tasks to complete as a technician. She goes on, after all of this time, to get her master's in aquatic and fisheries sciences. And that leads her to a set of socio-material practices. It's interesting to note that a lot of these practices are also part of Eva's own personal commitment and connection to her community. This idea of wanting to give back, and that whatever her professional role was, she needed to be giving back. She also had a very expansive idea of what science was. And so she sought out an outreach position. She has a deep identification with STEM domains. And she founded the local SOCNIS chapter. So SOCNIS stands for the Society for the Advancement of Native American and Chicano Scientists. And this organization is deeply rooted in mentorship at all different levels of the program. And it's also interesting to note that the SOCNIS chapter that Eva founded has won every major award that SOCNIS has to offer, so much so that SOCNIS said, okay, we have a different award for you so that other people can start winning chapter of the year. So Eva is now Director of Student and Enrollment Services at a local university, where she does this outreach work. She's operationalizing her definition of broadening participation every day. She also does this by running a STEM broadening participation summer program, which has served thousands of young people in her community. The young folks come to the university, work with scientists. It's a model that I think is very reminiscent of her time spent in Poole, and we've talked about that informally and how the experiences in Poole really informed and helped her transform what she wanted to do later on. So back to these constellations of situated events. This is what Eva said when I asked her, how did you learn that you could be and become a scientist? What was this pathway like? How did you decide that this is something that you could do, that you wanted to do? And she said her mentor gave her an opportunity. So you have the option of making this a 9-to-5 job. You come here, you do your work, you go home, and that's totally fine. You also have the option of exploring research, of going to meetings, of, after you're working here for a while, creating your own projects or discussing your own projects. So within this, you can see that Eva had an authentic task within this setting. She was a lab technician. And this is really important and I think central to her ability to use this space as a way to learn and practice. And so Levin Wenger's work, I think, really clearly aligns with this description of a constellation of situated events. She's got this real task that she's engaging in a complex context. As this lab technician, she has this legitimate role, and she has someone who's daylighting the creative practices of the community. When I say daylighting, this is a term from environmental education, where lots of streams have been covered over with culverts and concrete while people were building things on top of them. And a practice of environmental restoration is breaking open the culverts and releasing, getting the daylight back into the stream and doing a lot of riparian repair. And in this context, I mean, this is her mentor has now given her the ability to see much more of the creative practice that happens within a science lab than she would have in her position as a lab tech previously. So this is a really important thing, having someone to make it explicit and clear what's going on there. The other important aspect is the fact that she had to take it up. She had to decide that this is something that she wanted to do. So my mentor was incredible. She gave me the freedom to choose, let me know that these options were available, because I like challenges and I enjoy learning new things. I said, well, of course I want the second one. I had all of these amazing opportunities because of that. Someone daylighting, making the practices visible, and then access is really reciprocal. It entails both creating a space and then choice. Someone building a bridge and someone choosing to use that bridge. Or say, that's not the bridge for me, I want to build a different bridge. And that the mentors can create these access points, as Eva's mentor did for her. And participants have to choose that they want to engage, but that this participation really helped shape Eva's sense of being, what she could do, who she wanted to be, what she could do next. And the next two constellations of situated events are related to interpersonal relationships, which I think function in nuanced ways within Eva's name. She said, I was in a lab where there were graduate students and postdocs, and we're hanging out in the lab, we're going out into the field, into ridiculous, crazy, marshy conditions to collect fish. Here we have an example of interpersonal relationships that facilitate participation in authentic practices. She was hanging out with these people and going out with them to collect fish. They were studying the embryonic development of fish to better understand how cancer grows in people's bodies. She sees her peers as learning partners. She's hanging out. Hanging out becomes a learning opportunity. And it's through the interpersonal relationships that she deepened her participation in the field. The other way that these interpersonal relationships function was to help change Eva's idea of who she could become, and this becoming narrative that's connected to future possible selves, Marcus and Marius. Eva says, there was a part of that interpersonal space being brought into your professional setting. I really got to know them and to understand why they were in graduate school. What's also in this quote is thinking about why would it be important for Eva to get to know people who were in graduate school. She had no models within her immediate family. She had support from her immediate family, but they thought that she was incredibly successful as a lab tech. She had a 401k. Were you going to leave that job and go back to school? They didn't have a context for understanding why that might be an important move for Eva to make. And so 4 years in this cancer research lab, spending time with these folks, developing these interpersonal relationships, really helped to merge the professional and personal space in ways that helped Eva to see herself in a different way and to really understand the value of grad students' pathways. So Eva's journey into science participation included these authentic tasks in rich environments, access, agency, and engagement. Once someone gave her a choice to go in deeper, she chose to do so. And then these interpersonal relationships that had a variety of functions to facilitate deepening participation, to deepen her identification with the domain as STEM writ large, and to really help to shift her idea of possible future selves. And so this picture is the three-spine stickleback. This is the fish that Eva studied during her Master's of Science. And I put it up here because it's important to think about the expertise that she gained during that time that she was bringing into the designed context of COOL, the after-school program. Especially as we transition to question 2. What's the relationship between mentors' personal broadening participation experiences and their approaches to the design of learning environments geared towards broadening participation for youth? And I think this is really essential. Eva, as a person herself from a non-dominant community, had an operational definition of broadening participation from her own experience that she then chose to use in the work that she did with the young folks in our program. So in 2011, Eva joined the Sound Citizen program as their outreach coordinator. She connected COOL with SOCNES mentors, so she identified other graduate students who were part of SOCNES that were themselves questioning the pipeline. Is this where I want to be? Do I want to be a scientist? Do I want to be a bench scientist doing research? Or do I want to do something different? Do I want to think about what else I might do with this science degree? And Eva stepped into the role of outreach in pool by co-designing and teaching in the out-of-school time program. So she and I together taught the young folks, designed the program and curriculum, she was our liaison to the lab, so anytime we wanted to send samples back that the young folks had collected, she was the one who made sure they got processed and we got the data back in time. And for Eva, she said that this was really what met her goals for broadening participation and redefining it for herself. So here's a little bit more about her motivation to participate in pool. So SOCNIS, one of the reasons it started was to bring more kids into the science track instead of just the medical field. When you had minorities that were going into the sciences, they were often becoming doctors, which is great, but there was a sense among that community that we needed to broaden participation among the different kinds of science, because it was visible to those people who had advanced in their careers that these other opportunities and avenues to affect your community were not being participated in the same way. This is a narrative that is also supported by research. When a lot of folks who are from non-dominant communities are good at STEM, they go into medical fields because they can see a direct connection between their desire to do outreach and the work that they're doing as a doctor, a veterinarian, someone who's working in the community. And over time, Eva's interest in SOCNIS and her desire to change the narrative for young folks in the program was to help them see how the things that they were learning and doing within pool could be directly applied to questions that they might have about their own communities. So I need to tell you a little bit about Sound Citizen. It was a large citizen science project. This is a picture of the Puget Sound with the little Google dots demonstrating all of the places that Sound Citizen samples had come from. There were over 200 people collecting samples of water in either at the Puget Sound, from the drain spout coming off of their house, from puddles, from rivers, from streams, and they would send them all into the university, and researchers there were studying spices in Puget Sound. Spices: cinnamon, thyme, rosemary. Why spices? Because people are very interested in finding out how the cinnamon from their latte or the cookies that they made travels through the wastewater treatment system and ends up in Puget Sound. And they don't get as defensive as they might get if you told them the story of how the oil from their leaking car traveled through the wastewater treatment system and into the Puget Sound. So it was a way of talking with people about the connections between the land and the water in more productive and organic ways. So this particular graph, I think, is a really great example of the way that Sound Citizen used spices to get people interested and engaged. So they call this cinnamon flux, because they're studying cinnamon over time and parts per million in the grams per day over time, right? Somebody noticed it. And tell me what you noticed. What did you notice?
Christmas.
Christmas.
It's gotta be Christmas. I can't see the dates, but
Yep, Christmas.
I'm pretty sure that's
Exactly.
what it is.
120407, right? So Christmas and also Thanksgiving. There's a whole bunch of cinnamon that ends up in pumpkin pies and apple pies and all kinds of other things. One and very fascinating thing that I noticed, very small digression. I learned from Sound Citizen, cinnamon changes chemical structure when it passes through your body. And so they could tell the difference between the cinnamon that washed down the drain and the cinnamon that went through us and then ended up in the wastewater treatment system. So we decided that we needed to find a way to connect what was happening in Sound Citizen, their study of water and chemical oceanography, to a contemporary socio-scientific issue. And we chose feminization of fish in Puget Sound, specifically this fish. This is the English soulfish. This is a our students, the middle schoolers, decided that it was so ugly it was cute. I'm not sure that I'm convinced. But the English sole looks like this because it is a bottom-dwelling fish. It lives in the sediment. And so both of its eyes are on the top of its head, so one eye isn't, out of commission half of the time. And what was interesting to the students and also to our scientists was a peer-reviewed science article that had come out around feminization. And the endocrine system is what facilitates all of the communications, chemical communication in your body. And feminization relates to changes in the reproductive health of species connected to the presence of endocrine disrupting compounds. So these would be things like plasticizers, or lots of health and beauty products now have banned phthalates. Phthalates are also in the family of endocrine disrupting compounds. And they just mimic natural hormones. And the fish, in this case the English sole, couldn't tell the difference between estrogen coming from the surrounding waters and estrogen that would have been coming from its own endocrine system. So the male fish began to make a protein. Here's our peer-reviewed article. They began to make a protein that was used in egg production, and male fish have no need for such a protein, and so that counted as feminization. I want to share with you the abstract from this peer-reviewed article. So, vitellogenin is the name of the protein, yolk protein produced in the liver of oviparous animals in response to estrogens, normally occurs only in sexually mature females with developing eggs. However, males can synthesize it when exposed to environmental estrogens, making the abnormal production of this protein in male animals a useful biomarker for xenoestrogen exposure. Contemporary science, not settled. Really interesting socio-scientific issue connected to the land and the water. Extremely dense, difficult to go through, abstract. This is just the abstract. Wait till you get into the article. And what we chose to do with Eva and with her guidance was to think about how could we make this accessible to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders? What would it take to not dumb down the science or to reduce it in ways that weren't connected to the scientific concepts, but what could we do that would allow the young folks in our program to reason with data, to think with the data in the same ways that the scientists had? This was our design challenge. We came up with a series of activities. The young folks were learning the Sound Citizen sampling protocol, how to filter the water, what the steps are for going from a sample that comes from the sound into a hyper-concentrated sample that can go into a gas spec machine. They're learning about the wastewater treatment system. We made a puzzle so they could start thinking about these large things that are really difficult to manipulate and largely invisible to most of us. And then we also visited a model of the Puget Sound to learn about ocean currents and how things move and where there might be pockets that are less, where there's less current moving through them. And those might be places where sediment would gather, and fish living in those places might exhibit more feminization, for example. I want to take you into detail on the mapping activity. So these two representations come out of the paper. They sampled at all of these different sites around Puget Sound. This graph, even if it wasn't blurry, wouldn't really help you. At least it didn't help me. It's information about the site, which is the number on the top. The different gray scales correspond to the sites themselves. It's showing the percentage of male unfeminized fish and male feminized fish at each location. Point being that both of these representations require a lot of deep scientific knowledge in order to unpack and make sense of. And so there again, we were thinking, well, how do we take this into something that young folks can deeply engage in? So we chose to take the data back to the numbers. So instead of percentages, we went with this number of feminized male, this number of unfeminized male. And the feminized was represented by a red dot on the top and a black dot for the unfeminized male. And then we had the young folks make plates that we then stuck up and projected a map of Puget Sound in the same way so they could start to see where the data points were on the Puget Sound. And one of the other things I really love about this picture is you can see the adult model. This is what you want to do. You want to put the black dots that represent the unfeminized males and red dots for representing feminized males. And then you can start to see the young folks taking it in their own ways. The vampire is probably my favorite. It's not a smiley face. My youth participant would want you to know it's a vampire because it's very important. So this is how Eva set this activity up with the young folks. She said there were scientists, and here's our wonderful friend, the English soul again. You can see him pretty well blending into the sediment there. So there were scientists, and they wanted to see if these fish were being feminized. So we're going to look at some data that they found that showed that these fish were being feminized. What they found is that the males were making a chemical that only females make. and that they were putting it into their eggs. So we're going to explore where they were found around Puget Sound, if you guys can pull out the data packet. And that's the same packet that contained the numbers that led to this longer conversation. I'm going to hop back 1 second to this slide. This is us just getting ready to have this sense-making conversation with the young folks after they've helped to build the model. And this is what came out of it. Young folks saying, oh, we're living in a feminized fish area. And what I want to really point out with this particular slide are the ways that the youth were reasoning in the same ways that the scientists were. From the scientific paper we get, the results of this study indicate that exposure of flatfish to xenoestrogens in the Puget Sound is widespread, i.e., we're living in a feminized fish area. As young folks say, we need to know what chemicals are in Puget Sound to know if that may be causing male fish to become feminized. And the scientists agree. More work is needed to characterize the concentrations and distribution of xenoestrogens in Puget Sound and the biological impacts of those compounds on English sole. So to us, this designed space where we have these socio-material arrangements of Eva being in the room as a scientist with her expertise studying embryonic development of three-spined stickleback fish, the activity of building the model together and making sense of that through conversation, led to the young folks reasoning with the data in the same ways that the scientists had. And in ways that were personally powerful to them and led them to design their own study, which they ended up using the infrastructure of the Sound Citizen Lab to study health and beauty products and how plasticizers and phthalates were traveling through the wastewater treatment system into the sound that could be having impacts on feminization of fish. When we get back to the cultural learning pathways now, I feel like the first part of the talk was a really great way of thinking about how Eva's experiences laminated, added up over time to her orientations to designing the activity that you just saw. However, there's still a question mark. How do we think about the design decisions that she made and how she designed within the pool infrastructure? And so I propose, I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out, and then I went back to interviews that I had done with Eva, and I realized that she told me how this happened for her and how she did it and why she did this. And this is where deep hanging comes in. So Eva says, so being able to understand where you fit within that cycle, and she means the cycle of scientific research here, I think comes from just being a part of it. I think part of it is the deep hanging that you do. Ideally, it should be through the mentorship of your advisor, but there are so many other people involved in getting you there to becoming a master or expert. It's not just a trickle down from one expert. So here, this deep hanging space, this is what Eva meant by how she was able to connect to the space, how she became a scientist, how she realized that this was something that she could do. This was in 2011. So we go from thinking about deep hanging learning experiences into deep hanging design approaches. So what does it mean to take your orientation towards this work that you've developed over time into a design space? So now places become authenticating socio-material practices, sharing with the young folks what it means to be in this space, how they can use the practices they already have in new ways. You were thinking about actions, but now actions are about creating opportunities and creating new ways for young folks to participate. And positions now become about creating new storylines and creating new ways for young folks to engage. And so we can see the design decisions directly tied to Eva's own experiences of broadening participation. Eva, as we recall, had these authentic tasks in rich environments. The young folks have a peer-reviewed article that they're going through and understanding. We didn't hand them the article to read, but we made sure that they knew that that's where this data was coming from. The access and engagement, here we have Eva breaking it down to the data so that the young folks could engage with it in ways that were meaningful and allow them to reason with the data. And then engaging youth in making a model, a visual representation that they could use to make sense of what was going on. Interpersonal relationships, all through the program, Eva was sharing her experiences. In the conversations about the model, I was initially concerned when she began to focus on vocabulary around it. But I realized that what she was doing in that space was making sure that the young folks were in the same reasoning space that she herself had been in when she was trying to understand the data. Whereas I might have prioritized first looking for patterns and then putting vocabulary on top of the patterns, she wanted to make sure that they were grounded in the science that was happening in order to have a deeper understanding of the patterns. And I think that's why we have young folks saying things like, we live in a feminized fish area, as opposed to, there's a lot of red dots over here. The implications of this, back to our pipeline. So according to various definitions of what counts as participation in STEM, Evas also a drip. And I reject that framing. And I think that what we need are new metaphors of participation. So one example is this wonderful collection called Pathways, Potholes, and the Persistence of Women in Science that is advancing lots of different metaphors of how we might describe this process of being and becoming a scientist. And in my own work, I've been working to really be part of the conversation around redefining participation. So redefining it to include the experiences of non-dominant communities in ways that is connected to their own senses of being and really makes space for multiple epistemologies. And I'm also really interested in broadening the definition of what it means to participate. So what's counted as valued participation, to include much more than a tenure track or a research focus. Also to include teaching, working community, and science communication. So I'd really like to thank my participants, all the program mentors, the youth and their families, the cool research team, which included lots of folks besides myself, which is another important component of design-based research projects, to think about who all makes these things happen. The Life Center, a wonderful intellectual community, and also the Sheshe Kone Center at Turk, where I'm currently a postdoc. Thank you so much.